You're listening to the Blue Ridge True Crime Podcast, bringing you compelling true crime stories from the Appalachian Mountains and beyond. I'm your host, Alfred Dockery. Grab your hat and a lantern, and let's get on the trail. Today's episode is The Ghost in the Ballad, Unraveling Frankie Silver. In the winter of 1831, in the remote mountains of North Carolina, a young woman named Frankie Silver was accused of the brutal murder of her husband Charlie. She was convicted of killing him with an axe, dismembering his body, and burning to pieces. She was the first woman executed by the state of North Carolina. But her story didn't end at the gallows. It became a legend, a ballad, a haunting question about justice in early America. I'm delighted to welcome Sharyn McCrumb, best-selling author of the Ballad series, to talk about her book, The Ballad of Frankie Silver, and discuss the story behind it. Ms. McCrumb, please introduce yourself.
I'm Sharyn McCrumb. I'm an Appalachian author, and I write books about the history and folklore of the Appalachian Mountains. My ancestors settled these mountains in the 1790s, and so I had people who fought at Kings Mountain and in the Civil War, and a long history of family connections with this region.
All right. The story of Frankie Silver has captivated people for nearly 200 years. What do you think accounts for its lasting appeal?
Why don't I start by telling you how I came to write the book? Can I do that?
Please do.
Okay. The way I work is that I get about an idea a week for a book. I get an idea that's so good that if you wrote the book, I would go out and buy it. But you can't write 50 ideas because every idea that you commit to costs you 2 to 3 years of your life, which means every year you're going to throw away 49 ideas, and probably more than that because you're working on a book for more than 1 year. So I have learned over time, over a long career, that the only books I write are the ones that won't go away. I might get an idea and talk about it and forget about it, but if one haunts me, if one stays with me and I find myself looking things up or going to places and just staying with it, sooner or later, I'm going to have to write that book to get rid of it. It's a form of exorcism. So with Frankie Silver, she wasn't in my mind. I'd never heard of her. On the day in the spring that I went down to Mitchell County, North Carolina, which is where she lived, and I was working on a different book. It was called She Walks These Hills, and it was about an escaped convict who was trying to get home after 20 years, and also the ghost of a pioneer woman who was wandering around in the same area. And I try to be very exact with my books in terms of getting the landscape right, for example. So I had two writer friends who lived in Bakersville, and they were going to drive me around so that we could look at the woods and the river and get the geography right for the last chapter of She Walks These Hills. So we did that for most of the day. And then about 3 o'clock, when we'd finished all that we needed to do, the two guys, Jack and Taylor, said, "Get back in the car. We want to show you something." So I got in, and they drove up a little mountain road, up and up to the top of a mountain. And there was a little white church on the side of the road and a cemetery behind the church. And so we got out and walked back to the cemetery, and they said, "This is where Charlie Silver is buried. Do you remember Charlie Silver?" I'd read a lot of Appalachian history by then, and it wasn't in the forefront of my mind, but I did ring a bell, and I said, okay, Charlie Silver, wasn't he murdered sometime in the early 1800s, and his wife was executed for the crime? And they said, yes, she was just a teenager, and he's buried here. And I looked at the cemetery, and there were a lot of graves that were obviously mid 20th century, professionally carved marble things. And I knew it wasn't one of those if he had been buried in the 1800s. But off farther from the church were 3 knee-high stones, splinters of rock, not professionally carved, that had never had any writing on them. And there were 3 of them. And I said, it's got to be one of these 3. These are the oldest graves here. Which one of these is Charlie Silver? And Jack said, all of them. Charlie Silver has 3 graves. How can you not write that story? So it turned out that he had been killed in December when the snow was knee deep and the river was frozen, and the only way to dispose of the body was to dismember it. And when the searchers found the body finally, after they figured out where to look, they didn't find it all at once. And it was going to be his family, his brothers and father, who buried the remains. But since they didn't find them all at once, they buried what they found. And then when they found more, they started over. And so he ended up with 3 graves because he was buried sequentially. But I looked at these graves and I said, you said that the wife who was executed for this crime was a teenager. And they said, yes, that's right. And I said, then she didn't do it. Who did? And they said, no, she was tried. She was convicted. She was hanged. And I said, because I read an awful lot of criminal history from Europe and America. And I said, there has never been a case of a woman younger than 30 working alone, dismembering a body. It has never happened. I said that 30 years ago. It has still never happened. And my reasoning was, if it has never happened, she didn't do it. So then I wanted to know what really happened. For over 150 years, people had just said, oh, she chopped him up and she killed him. In 2 minutes, I figured out that was wrong, and it was going to take me 4 years to untangle what really did happen. And as I continued to study this case, I got to the part where at the hanging, she's there and the sheriff asks her if she has any last words. And you're supposed to have last words in the 19th century because it was a very religious time. And they believed that if you confessed your sins, you would go to heaven. But that if you died with the sin still in you, that you were doomed forever. And so she stepped forward and started to speak. And her father was in the crowd. He and her brother Jackson had come to take the body back up to the mountain for burial. And so when she started to speak, her father called out, die with it in you, Frankie. And she stepped back and was hanged without saying a word. Daddy didn't do it. I knew where he was. He was on a long hunt in Kentucky with Jackson at the time that Charlie Silver went missing. So if Daddy didn't do it and she wasn't guilty, what did he not want her to say? The answer to that took me 4 years of research. But this was the beginning of the rabbit hole.
I want to talk for just a minute about the trial itself. And kudos to you for researching the ways the courts worked way back in the beginning of the 19th century. What do you think were the most interesting aspects of that trial for a modern reader that wasn't familiar with how they did business back then?
Do you mean English common law, the procedure of the trial?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. That was, I actually flew to London and talked to British barristers who in law school had to study English common law, although now even England doesn't use English common law. But we did. The 13 original states of the United States stayed on English common law well after the American Revolution. And it was a very unbalanced system in favor of the prosecution. Under English common law, defendants could not testify. People used to say, oh, she was a woman, they wouldn't let her testify. No, if she was the Pope, they wouldn't let her testify because that was the rules. And let me explain to you why that was. They, again, we're back to a very religious time. And when you testify in court, you go up and you put your hand on the Bible and you swear to tell the truth. You are speaking to God. You are saying, before God, I'm telling the truth. Now, if you are charged with a capital crime, your life is in the balance. And it would be so tempting to lie about it, to save yourself. In a religious society, they believed that lying to God, having taken that oath, lying to God was a worse sin in their eyes than whatever you did to be on trial in the first place. And so to protect your immortal soul, they removed the temptation from you. You couldn't lie to God because they wouldn't let you take that oath. So nobody who was a defendant could testify. You were allowed a defense attorney. The defense attorney could not cross-examine witnesses. So you were really very hamstrung. Very few people were acquitted because you couldn't get your side of the story out. In Frankie's case, there were 2 people in that cabin and an infant. Baby Nancy is not even talking, so we don't worry about her. Charlie's dead. He's not testifying. Frankie is forbidden by law to testify. So how are you going to get out the facts of what happened in that cabin? There's nobody to tell the story. She was represented by 2 members of council. Do you want to go into that now? There's been a big controversy with local researchers about who defended Frankie Silver. And some people said that it was Thomas Wilson because Thomas Wilson did the paperwork. He's the one who wrote to the governor and was the attorney of record. But what I found was that there were other factors involved. First of all, Morganton is a small town, and Frankie would not have been a sympathetic defender. Here's a woman who's a stranger from up the mountain, and they all think she's a crazy savage, and they think she's murdered her husband with an axe. And so she is not your sweet little defendant. This is not Ingrid Bergman. So if you're the local lawyer defending her, it might hurt your business. People who want deeds and wills done and whatever might say, we don't want to give business to that man that defended that axe murderer. So Thomas Wilson decides that what he needs is a face to be in the courtroom, to be the de facto lawyer. And he's going to be the guy behind the scenes guiding it. So the person he picks to defend Frankie Silver is a young lawyer, just a year into his practice. from Asheville, which is 40 miles away. It's not going to hurt his business because nobody 40 miles away is going to care about a case in Burke County. And he needs the experience because he's just started practicing, and he might need the money. So they bring in Nicholas Woodfin for his first murder trial. And to make sure that he does it right, here's Thomas Wilson, the old experienced attorney, guiding him behind the scenes. So I checked with a North Carolina attorney when I was researching the case, and he said, if you are accused of a capital crime in the state of North Carolina, you must be represented by 2 members of counsel. There you go, 2 lawyers. The law says so. Now later, after Frankie was convicted, but the tide of public sympathy turned in Morganton to where people had visited her in jail, considered how young she was, got to see her and realized she wasn't a crazy axe murderer, that here's this poor frightened teenage girl. Now they're sympathetic. Now they want maybe to get her pardoned. And at this point, Thomas Wilson wrote letters saying, I defended Frankie Silver, because now it was a popular thing to do. But in the beginning, it wasn't.
Yeah, that was a very interesting part of the story for me. A lot of people don't realize that back in the day, they didn't really imprison people. They tried you, and if they found you guilty, they did something to you. They might flog you, they might brand you, they might hang you. It's my understanding North Carolina didn't even have a penitentiary until 1870. So they didn't really lock people up. They tried them, they did something, and they moved on with their day.
Yes. Yeah, this is true. And they kept that rule that defendants couldn't testify past 1864 too. So the law has changed a great deal. There wasn't a lot they could have done with her if they had convicted her because they didn't have any place to put her.
Yeah.
You're right. One other interesting thing, I think, from a writer's point of view is why I chose Burgess Gaither as the person to tell the story in the Frankie Silver part of the story. When I look at a story, especially a true incident, the first thing I ask myself, I consider all the people who were involved, and I say, whose story is it? Who is the one who is most affected, who is changed by it? Who is the person also, this is important, who is the best person to guide the reader through the complexities of the story? And a lot of people, amateur writers who tried to write this story, would try to tell it from Frankie's point of view. And that doesn't work. I knew it didn't work. I didn't even try it. Frankie Silver, as young as she was, and lived up on a mountain 40 miles from town. That was probably the first time she'd ever been to town, was when she came with her hands tied to go to jail. So she was a deer in the headlights. Frankie was not so much a person as a situation. She was everybody else's problem. And she had no idea what was going on. The legal system, Martian to her. So she couldn't guide the reader through the 19th century legal system because she had no clue what was happening. So then I started thinking, all right, who else can we use? How about the judge? The judge came from Raleigh. He was a circuit judge. He came from Raleigh. He spent 2 days at the trial, went back to Raleigh, never saw or heard from her again. I mean, that was it. He had 2 whole days. The same thing is true of the district attorney. The district attorney came from Charlotte as a circuit prosecutor, prosecuted the case, went back to Charlotte, and that was the end of his involvement. Nicholas Woodfin, who defended her in court, spent his 2 days with her and then went back to Asheville and never returned. He did not attend the hanging. He did not visit her in jail. He went back to Asheville and he's gone. So, see who I'm eliminating? The judge is gone, the prosecutor's gone, the defense attorney's gone. How about the sheriff? Well, in North Carolina, we had one-term sheriffs. So when she was arrested, William Butler was the sheriff of Burke County. But by the time it was time to execute her, we had a new sheriff, John Boone. And that would break up the continuity. You can't start with one sheriff and end with another. You want one continuous narrator for your story. So I'm running out of people here. And finally, I settled on there was this one guy who was there the whole time. His name was Burgess Gaither. He was 23 years old. He was the clerk of court in Burke County. And biographically, he was a very good choice because he had grown up in way western North Carolina in a family where his father died when he was young, and he managed to get an education studying with a judge to qualify as a lawyer. And his older brother came to town in Morganton and established a law practice. And so Burgess came to town and he was going to have it made. He and his brother were going to go into practice together, and that was going to work out beautifully. Except that when he got to town to be his brother's junior partner, a month later, his brother died. He's got about 5 minutes experience as a lawyer. He can hardly run a law firm by himself. So what's he going to do? Fortunately, there was the richest man in Morganton had a number of daughters. And on the frontier, it's difficult to find enough eligible men to marry off your daughters. And here was this nice new young lawyer who was unattached. And so they invited him to dinner, and he and Elizabeth got friendly and got married, and that was very advantageous for him. I hope that they were truly in love, but from a business standpoint, when your father is the most powerful person, your father-in-law is the most powerful person in town, what he did, the father-in-law had been the clerk of court for 40 years. As soon as Burgess and Elizabeth get married, he resigns his clerk of court job and gives it to Burgess. So there's a nice steady job with a salary, and he doesn't have to worry about a law practice. It's a built-in job. And what he does is to take the notes during the trial, during the inquest, during the grand jury. So he's there all the time. He's there every step of the way. He's there when they bring her into the courthouse, arrested, through all the preliminaries, through the trial itself. And after the trial, when you are condemned in your trial, the appeal is automatic. But somebody has to write that appeal and send it off to Raleigh to be evaluated. And the person who writes the appeal is the clerk of court. He sends a summary of the trial to make sure that the trial was conducted fairly and that they followed the rules of law. And here's the best part. When a defendant has to be executed, it was done in those days publicly. It was done in the county where the crime took place, and the person who is doing the hanging will be the county sheriff. Somebody, though, has to be what's called the state's witness. Somebody has to represent the state of North Carolina as the witness to say this hanging was done legally, humanely, in a timely fashion, and so on. You certify that. It's not the judge, he's in Raleigh. It's not the prosecutor, he's in Charlotte and Woodfins in Asheville. Who is left to certify the fact that the hanging was done legally? And that person is Burgess Gaither. But Burgess is only 23 years old, and he grew up poor. And Frankie sat in that jail for a year and a half. He would have gotten to know her. She's a teenage girl. He's 23. He would have realized by then that there were extenuating circumstances to the death of her husband, that she has probably been caught now in a situation not of her own making, and she is a rabbit trapped. And he feels sorry for her. He doesn't think she ought to be hanged, but there's nothing he can do about it. And the irony of it is that of all the people in Burke County, he is the only person who is forced to watch her die, and he doesn't want it to happen. See why he's the perfect narrator?
I do. And you did quite a good job with him. He's charming and curmudgeonly, but he's a very good witness to the entire process.
Yes.
Okay.
And all of that, all those things are true. I didn't make up any of that. He was just tailor made to be the perfect narrator because he's sympathetic. And remember when I said, whose story is it? Burgess is the one who is changed by his association with her.
Now, I want to talk a little bit about the novel itself and
Okay.
about the choices you made in writing it. You have, when the ballad series, was that something that you envisioned, or did it just go from book to book?
It goes from book to book. I didn't start out wanting to write a series, and I actually take a very dim view of the whole series idea. Publishers love it. Publishers are like pushers. What they really want is to get readers to fall in love with a character, say Sherlock Holmes, for example, somebody that they will follow through umpteen adventures. And then you just try to sell them a book a year like a candy bar. But that's good for the profit margin of a publisher. Readers are happy because a lot of readers want an imaginary friend. And so they'll buy a book and spend the weekend in a paper bed and breakfast with their buddy. And it's like a little visit. The person that it's not good for is the author, because the author is pressured essentially to turn books into candy bars. And if they're Snickers, they have to have peanuts. And if they're Milky Ways, they do not have peanuts. They want you to write the same book with the same characters to feed the candy bar readers. And I never wanted to do that. I refused to do that. So I started out with If Ever I Return Pretty Peggy, which was a standalone book, but it became a New York Times notable book and won some awards. And naturally, the publisher said, oh, do it again, do it 50 more times. And so you can see a progression if you read the ballad novels. I started with the third one, edging away from that milieu that I had in the beginning, the sheriff and the deputy and the little town. And I go farther and farther away from it. By the time I got to Frankie Silver, the sheriff's office and the things that people thought of as part of the series were a very small part of the book. That's why the book was in two parts. The first part was the 1830s, and then you had the sheriff's office in the modern part. But it worked thematically because what I wanted to say in that book was that the legal system hasn't changed all that much. When Perry Smith was hanged for the murder of the Clutter family You saw that in Cold Blood by Truman Capote. He covered that case, 1959. Hickok and Smith were hanged in Kansas for murdering that family. And Perry Smith's last words were, "The rich never hang, only the poor and friendless." And I saw that with Frankie Silver, and I thought, is that still true? Yes, I think it is. So I built a case in the present that contrasted to Frankie. So you could go back and forth between the modern case in Riverbend Penitentiary and Frankie in the jail in Morganton. And the question was, have we become more civilized or only more mechanized? Has anything really changed? And that this book is studied in law schools. I think 8 law schools last time I heard. It's studied in universities all over the place because of this issue of the death penalty. One of the most interesting experiences I had with a class studying it was a class in a small town in rural New Hampshire was going to study the Ballad of Frankie Silver, and they invited me to come up and talk to their students. And I thought, how can I make these people relate to a girl who lived in North Carolina in the 1830s, and here are these modern kids all the way up in New Hampshire? But one of the things that I wanted people to understand in this book was the fact that there are two Souths. And there's the Flatland South, which was the plantations and the Confederacy and Gone with the Wind. But the Mountain South is not that place. Read Gone with the Wind or Steel Magnolias if you want to understand the Flatland South. But if you want to understand the Mountain South, the book you need and the movie you should watch is Braveheart, because that split between the Scots-Irish and the English goes back 1,000 years. And that's what you're dealing with in the South today. The Scots-Irish settled the mountains. The English, by and large, settled the flatlands and had the plantations and so on. And that antagonism between those two cultures continues to this day. And I needed those kids in New Hampshire to understand that. And I thought, because the mountains start in Georgia, but they go all the way up past Mount Katahdin, Maine, and into Canada. And so if you're sitting in New Hampshire, you're in Appalachia, not southern Appalachia, but you are still in a rural mountain culture. And so I got up and said to these kids, suppose that you, here in New Hampshire, were charged with a crime. For example, you maybe killed somebody in a car wreck and you're going on trial for it. But instead of trying you here in your little town in New Hampshire, they take you to trial in Boston. And the kid in the front row said, "We're screwed." And he was right. He understood it immediately, that the culture of Boston is completely different from that rural culture in New Hampshire. And it's the same thing that happened to Frankie. She's in a rural mountain community, and they took her to trial in Morganton, 40 miles down the mountain, but across an invisible barrier between the Scots-Irish culture and the English. So here's this girl whose maiden name was Stewart, and she's tried in an English court under English common law. And she doesn't have a chance because the preconceived notions are going to crush her.
When you're writing about a story like Frankie Silver or Tom Dooley, and you're pretty far in the past, and the record is often sparse and sometimes contradictory, how do you navigate those gaps?
Rudyard Kipling had a saying, "What do we know of England who only England know?" And that maxim is very good for people who are doing research too, because I found that a lot of people, especially amateur historians who did research on Frankie Silver and Tom Dooley, focused very tightly on the place where it happened. They'd focus on Morganton and Mitchell County or Wilkes County in the case of Tom Dewey, and not look anywhere else. And the problem with that is that you're missing a lot that way. So let me give you an example from Frankie. How was Frankie Silver hanged? I promise I'll get back to Tom Dooley in a minute.
Okay.
How was Frankie hanged? One of the researchers who wrote a little self-published book, and one morning when somebody has a book that is entitled The True Story, I take that with 100 pounds of suspicion, because that's a selling point and they can't prove it. Anybody that says The True Story is hyping it. Went around and asked old people in the 1980s and 90s to describe the hanging. 1980s and 90s. So these people would have been born about 1910. She was hanged in 1833. They're 3 generations away from anybody that could have told them. What he's getting is cowboy movies. They describe very meticulously how the platform was built and the trapdoor and the T-post with the... Yeah, Clint Eastwood, Hang 'em High. I saw that movie too. But that's not what happened. So what I did, and this is where the what do they know about England comes in, I looked not just at Frankie's hanging, because an 80-year-old Mitchell County resident is going to be no help. But let's go back to the historical record. Let's see how people were hanged that we can verify. The closest hanging that I could find to Frankie Silver, 1832, was Nat Turner, who was the instigator of a slave rebellion in Virginia. He and his band of people killed 16 whites in a period of a couple of weeks. They knew they were going to hang Nat Turner. They knew they were going to hang him before they caught him for all those murders, and he was a black man. So I looked at the record because it's very well documented. And when it was time to hang Nat Turner, and as I said, they had weeks and weeks to prepare for the hanging. There was no question. Nobody's pardoning him. So they could have built a trapdoor and all the fancy bells and whistles. What they in fact did was to get a ladder, take him to an orchard, put him on the ladder with the rope around his neck, pull the ladder away, and he dropped. That was 1832. Now, let's go to Frankie in 1833. She's in Morganton. She's got, first of all, a one-term sheriff. He has never hanged anybody before. In your term of office, it would be unlikely for you to have to do it more than once, if at all. Number 2, he's got a county budget. It probably doesn't allow for carpenters and engineers and so on. So, number 3, he's not sure that execution is going to happen because she's a young girl. Half of the jury had signed a petition asking the governor to pardon her. And so and he doesn't want to kill her. He's got daughters her age. And he's known her because he's been sheriff for months while she was sitting in jail. So he knows she's not this crazed killer. This is something he doesn't want to do. So he puts it off. Every day he thinks he's going to see the rider come galloping over the hill, waving a piece of paper, which is the pardon from the governor. And it doesn't happen. And so finally, on the appointed day in July, when he's got to do it, He takes the rope down out of the barn. It's been seasoned there with a weight on it so that it won't stretch. He takes the rope, he puts her in a cart, takes the cart up Damon's Hill to an open field up there, and hangs her by standing her on the cart and pulling the cart away, because he doesn't have the technology to do the trapdoor thing. I looked again at Tom. This is where Tom comes in. There was a reporter from a New York newspaper
Oh,
who
yes.
covered Tom's hanging. Now, that was 30 years later. That was 1867. I haven't read Tom in a while.
I understand.
But yeah, 66, no, 1868,
Yes.
May 1st, when he was hanged. It was 30 years later, so technologically, they should have been more advanced. And it was only 30 miles away. It was in Statesville. So the culture, you're talking about essentially the same area and the same sort of people, and just 3 decades different. But if anybody had a trapdoor, it should have been Tom. And we know how he was hanged because that reporter covered it. They put him on a cart, they took him to the railroad depot, and put the rope around a T-post that they had constructed and pulled the cart away. So why would Frankie have a trap door if 30 years later they're still using horse-drawn carts 30 miles away? The first time that I found a hanging using the cowboy movie platform, stairs, the whole thing we picture, the first time I saw that used was in 1859 in Charlestown, then Virginia, at the hanging of John Brown, who had attacked the arsenal there at
Oh,
Harper's
yes.
Ferry. Now, the hanging of John Brown was carried out by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And I contend that if you have the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers in charge of your facilities, you can spend all the money you want and get all the technical expertise you need to put on whatever show you want. But they didn't have that in Statesville for Tom, and they didn't have that in Burke County for Frankie. They had local people doing just the minimum. When you got the trapdoor business in the Wild West, the Clint Eastwood movies, you're talking about the 1880s, which is 50 years past the time of Frankie Silver. So you see the difference in research. Go ask some old person in the county and believe whatever they say, or actually do research into how hangings were performed and carried out and compare them. And that's what I did to do the comparison. And it just didn't make sense to believe that there was a platform.
I'd like to transition to talking about the ballad itself. There's usually more than one ballad, but the one I found for Frankie Silver, are you familiar with it?
This dreadful, dark, and dismal day.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, yes. I quoted that one in the book. Let me tell you how I found it.
Okay.
In those days, Frankie Silver was not well known at all. Now you go online and you find all these things written, and you find videos and podcasts and many recordings of the Ballad of Frankie Silver, including the New Lost City Ramblers. But if you look at when those musical recordings were posted, it's 2010, 2015. It's 25 years after the book was written. When I started studying Frankie Silver, she was more obscure than Paul Newman's first wife. And the song itself, nobody knew it. I went to the Heinemann Settlement School, which teaches writers' workshops and things in the summer. And one of the people who was there was Betty Smith, who is a famous folk singer from Western North Carolina. She lived in Madison County, and she would do performances, um, and was very knowledgeable about folk music. And so we knew that a ballad existed, and we tried to find it. What I had to do to get a copy of the Ballad of Frankie Silver was contact the Library of Congress. And it turned out that in the 1930s, with the WPA project, where they were coming up with jobs for writers and artists, a lawyer in Asheville named Bascom Lamar Lunsford, who is famous for being a folklore collector and a song collector, he had recorded a number of songs, traditional ballads and local folk songs, for the Library of Congress on a reel-to-reel tape recorder. And they had duly archived it there in Washington. And so I applied for one, and they sent me a copy on a reel-to-reel tape, which we managed to transfer. Remember, this is the early 1990s. This is pre-internet.
Yes.
So we are in another era. We managed to transfer it to a cassette tape so that I could play it in the car. And I took that cassette with me to Heinemann. And Betty and I got in the car, and we drove around all afternoon while she learned the song, and went back to her apartment there at Heinemann and worked out the chords. And so that night, I did the first reading from the Ballad of Frankie Silver, a section from the book, and Betty played the ballad, just having learned it that afternoon. And it was probably the first time that ballad had been sung in decades. Now, as I said, people are putting versions of it up all the time, but that's how we got it, from Bascom Lunsford.
Now, the ballad itself, how would you say it compares with the actual story of Frankie Silver?
It doesn't. They use her name. It's a jumping off point. Murder ballads were originally meant to be cautionary tales. A lot of times the killer is the narrator, and he says, "Look at what I've done, and I'm doomed for eternity for my sins. Don't you do this, or it'll happen to you." And Frankie's is more doleful, but it's written by somebody who doesn't really know the facts of the case. I think they've known, okay, young girl hanged in the 1830s in Burke County. How would she talk? And it's like a historical novel. You pick Richard the Lionhearted and have a soliloquy as if you were Richard, and it may have nothing at all to do with what he thought or felt. You're just using his name and creating a character. And I think that ballad is even more of a work of fiction than anything else. It's just, let's pretend we know what a convicted killer would say. And it's the language is wrong. As a professional writer, if you want my opinion, it is an amateur poet using very stilted language and talking not at all the way Frankie herself would talk. It's very Victorian in its sentiment and in its vocabulary. The other thing about it is, in comparison to other murder ballads, I think that I had to ask myself, why is it so obscure? I mean, think about it. The banks of the Ohio never faded from memory. You could find people all along that would sing you the banks of the Ohio. The Ballad of Tom Dooley was written in the 1920s, but never faded from attention. How many murder ballads? Poor Ellen Smith, Oh Me Wise. People knew those ballads and they never had to be revived. They stayed right along. But Frankie disappeared. And really until my book came out and people got interested again in the story. But I looked at those other ballads and said, what is different? Why would Frankie's ballad not be as popular as those others. And what I found was that the other ballads, in terms of the words now, the other ballads are more dramatic. The other ballads describe the killings.
Mm-hmm.
Frankie's doesn't. She says, I took his blooming life away, which is hardly graphic. That's pretty Victorian. That's putting skirts on piano legs. But the banks of the Ohio and the Knoxville girl, they're very specific in how she cried, oh, Willie, don't murder me. I cannot face eternity. So the drama, they're like little 3-minute movies. You see it happening. And you don't do that with the Frankie Silver song. So I think it wasn't that interesting. I asked 2 musician friends what they thought of it because I don't feel qualified to critique music. I thought that it was a very tedious song and that it didn't have highs and lows. It just seemed rather monotonous to me. One of my friends who does traditional music said that it was a great fiddle tune and that he thought it was better than the Ballad of Tom Dooley, musically speaking.
Mm.
And the other one said that he thought it was a good ballad because Tom Dooley was too jaunty and cheerful to describe a murder, but that the Frankie song was sad, as it should have been. Okay, but for some reason, it did not capture and hold the attention of the public. And I think ultimately the success of a song should be judged by how it stays in the public's consciousness.
I agree. The same thing struck me when I read the lyrics. The vocabulary is just way beyond the anything that you would expect from that time and place. It just doesn't fit. All right. Let's talk a little bit about the aftermath of the case. Why do you think that neither Governor Stokes nor Governor Swain issued a pardon for Frankie?
Let's talk about David Swain. It was David Lowry Swain, who was from Western North Carolina. And if you remember Zebulon Vance, who was governor of North Carolina during the Civil War, his mother was a childhood sweetheart of David Lowry Swain. That's, in fact, how Zeb Vance got to go to law school at UNC Chapel Hill, is because he wrote to Mom's old boyfriend and got a recommendation to get into college. So David Lowry Swain was well known in the western part of the state, which was unusual because most of the governors then and now come off the golf course through the country club into the governor's mansion from the eastern part of the state. But he was one of the few western governors. So David Swain knew all the people everybody who was anybody in western North Carolina was an acquaintance of his. So they all knew him. Now, the trial happens and she is convicted, and suddenly they want a pardon for her. Jurors are signing it. The ladies of the town are appalled that this young girl is going to be publicly executed. And they write to not to the governor, like this faceless person that we may think of, a bureaucrat today. They write to David, whom they know, and ask for the pardon. Now, he's in an interesting situation because he doesn't want to offend his friends back in Western North Carolina. But on the other hand, he's a politician and he's got to worry about public opinion. Now, he will sit and think about this. Public opinion. All these nice ladies want Frankie pardoned. But women can't vote. So who cares what they think? What's important is the male half of the state, because they're the voters and they're the people who are influential and hold offices. So you can't annoy them. What do they want? If you pardon a woman who murdered her husband, you will probably offend a great many people who think that maybe they should start worrying if women are getting away with murder. But he can't just say no. Now, Morganton is in the 1830s. If you want to get a letter from Morganton to Raleigh, it's going to be a 3-day proposition. Even a rider or a stagecoach. This is something that you've got to allow 3 days for your letter to get there, and 3 days minimum for a reply. So they write to the governor and ask, please pardon her. And the letter gets there about a week before the execution. So he writes back the next day or the day after, very shortly, he writes back. And what he says is, remember, by the time he gets the letter, we're down to 4 days left. He writes the letter and he says, Frankie Silver has already been hanged. I'm sorry I didn't know about this earlier, or I wish I could have helped you. Well, they get the letter in Morganton. She's not dead. She's got another day or two to live. But by the time they sit down and write a letter, and it takes 3 days to get back to Raleigh, he doesn't have time to write a letter back, and that's 3 more days. The time has run out because of that 3-day back and forth. So by the time he gets a reply, she's going to be dead. And I thought, how convenient. Because the people who don't want her pardoned don't get her pardoned, and the people who did want her pardoned, he apologizes to because it was a clerical error, and he's not blamed any way around. So I sent all this information to my friend, the district attorney, by fax, and I wrote at the top, read this. Is it possible that the governor of North Carolina was a weasel? And immediately the district attorney wrote back and said, have you ever had one that wasn't?
Yeah, I've got 2 last questions for you. I have to ask you why Frankie's father yelled out at the execution, die with it in you, Frankie.
Yes. Okay, let's do that. I talked to a lot of experts when I was working on this book. And this book really couldn't be written today because most of the people that I interviewed have died since the book came out. I talked to Wayne Silver, who was descended from one of Charlie's brothers and was the keeper of all the family legends and paperwork. I talked to a descendant of the sheriff who hanged Frankie, and he has died. But among the people that I talked to for the case itself was an FBI profiler, an official at Scotland Yard while I was in London, a deputy sheriff from Appalachia, a psychic, the woman who was the inspiration for Nora Bonesteel, and an attorney, a prosecuting attorney and a defense attorney. Now, none of these people met each other. They talked to me one-on-one at different times. But in each case, what we did was what lawyers do, which is to come up with a scenario for the murder and for the aftermath. And they all came up with the same answer. The question was, what happened in that little cabin on that snowy December night in 1831? And we walked through it, just like they used to do on Criminal Minds. And they all came up with the same answer. And that I felt like we must have it right. And here's what I think happened. We know where Charlie was. The Youngs, who were neighbors a couple of miles away on a farm, were having a party because it was the Christmas season. And the party meant lots of drinking and fiddle playing and so on. And the wives are staying home with the babies. So Charlie's off carousing and Frankie's home with the baby. And he stays a couple of days, comes home, and at this point, the snow is knee deep and the river is frozen. And so that little cabin is more isolated than it's ever been because you're snowed in. So Charlie comes in, he's either drunk or hungover, anyway, not feeling his best. And he's just trudged through a couple of miles of snow to get there. And she's probably not happy at having been left with this baby and having to gather wood and all of his chores while he's off enjoying himself. And so she probably starts nagging him about his deficiencies as a husband. And the baby starts crying because they're getting loud and shouting at each other. And then you've got this infant squalling. This is not what you need if you're hungover. And he can't go outside and cool off because of the snow. He's trapped in this cabin with a nagging wife and a screaming baby. And I think he probably said something like, if you don't shut that baby up, I will. And at some point she takes the weapon, I think it was a hatchet, and strikes him in the temple. We have the testimony from the doctor who did the autopsy that he had a broken bone in his skull. So he's dead. And it was a 2-second thing. And she can't take it back, but he's dead. Now, what are you going to do? You're a teenage girl. You're not going to go to his family because they're not going to be on your side. Her father is on a long hunt in Kentucky, chasing the elk herds with her older brother. So he's out of it. If he had been home, it would have been a different story. Then she could have gone to Daddy and said, what are we going to do? Daddy's big and strong, and big brother, big and strong, like 2 football players. They can take that body out and nobody ever find it. But the snow is a factor and Daddy's not home. So she goes across the frozen river to her parents' cabin, where her mother and her 10-year-old brother are, Blackston and her mother. They're not a lot of help. They're not any stronger than she is, but she goes to her mother and says, okay, I killed Charlie. It was an accident. What am I going to do? You can't get in touch with the father. He's over in Kentucky. You couldn't even write to him because he's hunting. Mama comes to the Silver cabin, to Frankie's cabin, and sure enough, Charlie's dead. They can't drag him outside and try to bury him because you leave tracks in the snow. I mean, dragging a body through the snow, that's not going to be real hard to figure out. You got to do something with that body within the cabin. So the only thing to do is, they think, is to try to burn the body. So what I think the mother said, Barbara probably told her daughter, go stall your in-laws and I will take care of this. So Frankie gets the younger Silver brother to come and chop wood for her and do some chores, feed the cattle. And meanwhile, Barbara is dismembering that body the way you would butcher a deer. And what they're going to do with it, again, because the river's frozen, you can't dump the body in the river. You can't drag the body away through the snow. So let's burn it. We have a fireplace. Well, the people who tried to burn the Romanovs during the Russian Revolution could have told them that you can't burn a body effectively. It's about 98% water, unless you have a great deal of heat, like in a crematorium, which is not what you have in a fireplace. But they tried. So they burned the body in the fireplace. And what they ended up not being able to burn, because again, there's a question of how much wood they've got to work with. So they hid parts of the body outside under the snow and in the woodpile and so on. But they got rid of it. When she finally reported Charlie missing, the searchers looked through the woods and they checked the river to see if the ice had been broken, that maybe he had fallen in coming back from the Young's place. Couldn't find any trace of him at all. And finally, an old bear hunter named Jack Collis went to the cabin itself. At this point, Frankie had gone home to Mother. The cabin was empty. And he has a hunch. So he looks at the fireplace. He goes outside to the stream and puts water in a kettle and puts it on the fireplace, waits until the water gets boiling, scoops up some of the ashes out of the fireplace and dumps them in the kettle. And he gets grease bubbles. You don't get grease bubbles from firewood. You get it from flesh. So he knows that something has been burned in that fire, something organic has been burned in that fireplace. And then he starts rooting around in the ashes and discovers little bits of bone. He brings the searchers back out of the woods and away from the river, and they take up some of the floorboards of the cabin, and they find blood dried under where the floorboards were. So now they know what happened to Charlie. Frankie, nobody's talking. Barbara by this time has gone home before the searchers ever get to the cabin. But Frankie has been at the cabin all along. So nothing could have happened, they think, without her being there. So she's arrested. She doesn't talk. She doesn't confess. She doesn't explain. She's just absolutely silent. So they put her on trial. They convict her. They're going to hang her. She's standing there on the gallows. She says, "Do you have any last words?" And her father says, "Die with it in you, Frankie." What is he trying to tell her? He is saying, "Look, Frankie, we can't save you. Jackson and I came to Morganton and broke you out of jail, and they caught us and took you back. That was the best we could do. We have come with the wagon to take your body away back up the mountain so that the medical students don't get it. If you try to explain what happened in that cabin and the fact that your mother is the one who dismembered the body, it will not save your life, but it might cost her hers. So die with it in you. Protect what you can, because nothing is going to save you. What's the point of giving them another sacrifice?" And I'm sure that's what he was saying.
Okay. So let me ask you one final question. For modern audiences, what's the lesson of Frankie Silver's story?
The rich never hang, only the poor and friendless. So that's one of the things I wanted them to take away from it. And the other thing was the fact that there are two Souths, that the stereotypes are still in existence. Today at UVA, University of Virginia, has a rivalry with Virginia Tech, which is in Southwest Virginia. And UVA used to have bumper stickers that said, "All dirt roads lead to Tech." You still have that perception that people from the mountains are poor and uneducated and it just, you can fight it all you want to. I addressed it in an earlier book where I had a character that had a disease called Korsakoff syndrome, which is a form of brain damage. The movie 50 First Dates deals with that, where your memory is only a few minutes long and then you forget and you're stuck in the past. And I find when I try to talk to people about Appalachia that the whole country has Korsakoff syndrome. You can sit down and patiently explain to them that we had universities and physics departments and Wi-Fi and all of the things that everybody else has in modern times, and they will nod solemnly and say, okay. And then the Korsakoff's disorder sets in and their brain resets, and they go back to thinking that we wear bonnets and long dresses and ride around in buggies.
All right. We'll leave it there. I am going to close with a recommendation for folks to read your book, The Ballad of Frankie Silver. It is a masterpiece. And thank you so much for making time to talk with me today. That's it for this episode of the Blue Ridge True Crime Podcast. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please hit subscribe and leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It helps more people find the show. Check the show notes for links to the Blue Ridge True Crime Substack and YouTube channel, and any story-related links. Until next time, I'll look for you on the Backroads.